This is a home built by William Coit, 1763. But actually, the Coit family in New London goes back to the 1660s when Coit came here and became involved in shipbuilding. The family was always involved in shipbuilding, and they had shipyards right down on this cove here. If you look, you see that's filled land. You can see behind the houses across the way was where the Coits had their shipyards. People like Coit built the ships that the mariners used in the West Indies trade. New London from the very beginning was a seaport. Merchants like Nathaniel Shaw, who lived here, this was his home. He was involved in the West Indian trade. And people like Nathaniel Shaw became extremely wealthy. In the 18th century, the islands of the Caribbean, the West Indies, most of them, their one big crop was sugar. So places like New London supported the plantation system down there in the West Indies.
The trade lasts really until the 1830s, when the plantation system in the islands begins to break down, and the London investors who were backing all of those sugar plantations are looking to new industry for investment. The slaves are freed down there, and so the mass markets for agricultural products and lumber begins to dissipate.
Being a seaport, New London has always had a customs house. This customs house was built in 1833. It was designed by Robert Mills, who actually designed the Washington Monument. A customs house was important because the federal government depended on custom duty to finance the government. The whaling ships that came in, their cargo would come through this customs house. Today, this building is now a museum, but the federal government still does maintain an office here as a customs office because New London is still an active seaport. This is Starr Street in New London. This street is really built on land that at one time was a rope walk. Being a seaport, there was a great need for rope, so this whole length of this street would be one long building, like a shed, where they would make rope by twisting hemp. The rope walk burned in the early part of the 19th century and left this whole block here empty. So instead of rebuilding the rope walk, they built these lovely houses. I think it's a good example to show you how New London was so prosperous in the first half of the 19th century, that these were the homes of the middle-class merchants, and this is where they lived. This is what we call Whale Oil Road. These houses were built in 1834 by Ezra Chappell, speculation to sell to people like whaling captains. These were expensive homes. These homes would have been for people like captains and whaling merchants who made money. The ordinary seaman, he never could have afforded a home like this. This would be a desirable place to live because they could walk downtown and be right where the docks were. This is the home of Acor Barnes, and Acor Barnes is what we call a whaling agent. The whaling agents often own the whaling ships, but they would hire the captain, they would hire the crew, and they would get the supplies. And they are the ones who were in charge of the whaling voyages. They not only got the profits from the whaling voyage itself, they owned the warehouses. And when the whaling ship came back, if whale oil was not selling at a high enough profit, they could store the oil and then sell it later. So they were the ones who became very wealthy. This is the New London Public Library. This library was a gift from Henry P. Haven. Henry P. Haven was a whaling agent, but he also was involved in the guano trade. There are many other public buildings in New London, like our hospital and the Lyman Allen Art Museum. Some of the monuments, our sailors and soldiers monuments, were gifts to the city from people who made their money from whaling and other maritime pursuits.